welcome everyone. This is the workshop part of the 2 days, and so you can all take your jackets off and get relaxed and informal now. So we're going to be workshopping. What we're going to be talking about is something that we touched on in a number of sessions, and certainly came up quite strongly yesterday with some of the early presentations. Private networks and what that means for clearly small cells will have a role to play, and small networks. We obviously think at the networks level in the small cell forum. So it's not just about deploying the boxes, but thinking about the network functionality. And what's really important for us to keep a handle on here for private networks is risk of fragmentation. So that's something that we fear quite a lot in the small cell forum. Fear is the wrong word. We anticipate and we think about appropriate ways in which we can consolidate needs and supply so that we don't get too much fragmentation and run out of steam in a particular sector. Because the interesting thing, as we discussed yesterday, is there are different paces of movement happening across a number of the different industry sectors who are thinking about deploying private networks. And there's some reference public announcements that are in the tens of networks that are being deployed and are being used, generally 4G and some 5G. And there are other sectors that are still talking and just have slideware. And that difference in pace across the different sectors, it potentially could mean that there's a little bit of a fragmentation which we need to be aware of, so we can see common threads and common needs across. And that's what we're going to start talking about in these sessions. We've got 3 sessions lined up. The first one is very much a sort of industry insider concern, but it's very important, especially for those who are speccing out products. We do need to think about our spectrum needs. So we will cover spectrum. We will then have a discussion about supply in terms of what does the supply landscape look like. We'll hear from people playing in that space and incubating innovations in the private network space, offering solutions, and then we'll have a discussion about the demand side and how to consolidate that demand and understanding of the need, and then we'll wrap up with the final panel. Now, the driver for this workshop is actually we've been talking quite a lot to the Department for International Trade, and the Small Cell Forum has been understanding that there's a degree of interest in the ICT sector of that department in terms of understanding the opportunity for workshops and a Europe-wide view in terms of how private networks are going to play out the role of the UK in that ecosystem. And so we're partnering and helping with the discussions and the planning in terms of how that may look. I was involved in a private networks workshop, UK to France, which happened in December, still very much a virtual event at that time. So UK to France joint workshop for a few hours, where we talked to system integrators, we talked about some of the sector needs, and we've continued that discussion as we've gone into this year. And as I say, this is the second in the series of workshops, which starts to explore some of the issues that we found or discovered in the first workshop and continues to flesh out. And our motivation is that we will have a private network session. It may not be a workshop, it may be actually within the mainstream of the conference in the Small Cell World Summit next year. So you can put that in your calendar. If you want to talk about private networks, we'll definitely be talking about private networks next year, I guarantee you. And this is all part of building up on a program of work over the next 12 months. Internal forum activities, as well as liaising externally with other fora and with government policymakers who are thinking about the private networks agenda. So that gives you some context into where we're going, and that will help. You may understand where I'm coming from in terms of the questions that I ask panelists, but also any questions or any issues that they raise. I mean, I'm going to be keen to also have interaction with the audience, so there are mics as usual floating around. There's fewer of you now, so hopefully the mic guys can get to you quickly and we can have a discussion. So for each panel we will have presentations, relatively rapid fire, and we'll have time for a discussion, Q&A at the end, and people can ask clarification questions, or they can take the discussion on that thread. Right, without further ado, having given the background and the shape of the workshop, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Bjorn, who actually very kindly is sponsoring, Ericsson are kindly sponsoring this workshop. So Bjorn, over to you to give us a heads up on your interests.
Thank you, Simon. So, good to be here. My name is Bjorn Odenhammar, and I'm responsible for networks and managed services across UK and Ireland, kind of a CTO, you can call me. So it's a dear topic for me to talk about private networks today. But if we sort of take a journey back and think about what did the guys in 3GPP a little bit more than 10 years ago, what did they think when they were sort of imagining 5G? What did they, what came through their mind? Probably not exactly that statement, but it's a nice marketing statement that I think well summarizes where we are today, where 5G plays a big role then, because we have spoken a lot today about, and yesterday, about how does this change business and business models and what's out there, what's the role of 5G as a technology, obviously, and something dear to my heart, how does this then help to drive a sustainable future? We'll see if I click there. Here we are now. 5G is available. As Ericsson, we are working across multiple sectors, collaborating with whether it's mines or whether it's manufacturers. And we have learned a lot. We started this journey 7 years ago with Ericsson Research, who engaged in a number of these opportunities, and now we're well into the deployments. And what we have learned, right, is really the needs from a private network and the needs from the enterprise sector is security. That comes front and center. They want to know where their data is, how the data is handled into the private network systems. It's also scalability. How can you manage one factory? I own 5 factories or mines or ports. How do you manage that? How can you scale? But it's maybe the most important part is reliability. So what you put in there needs to work, and it needs to sort of give the right in-service performance, and you need to guarantee me that the factory output or the port production or whatever will be maintained, because that's the key. So, I mean, we've all seen these type of figures, right? So we can all agree that the business opportunity is big, whether it's $750 billion that McKinsey believes, or whether it's another figure that sort of analysis Mason talked about yesterday. We can all sort of think about and have a view, but the opportunity is there, and it's big, and it's for us to really sort of capitalize on as an industry. We can see that with technology, we can improve margins. So we can actually, with like Industry 4.0, drive digitalization, and there will be benefits from that. But maybe what's sort of most dear to my heart is also how we can actually secure a more green planet. And if we look a little bit from a sustainability angle and see what role do we as an industry play, I mean, there's some sort of horrific stats there to the left, right? And just to put it into context, if you look on the wildfires, the 6,450 tons of megatons of CO2 emission, that was just from wildfire. Do you know, does that figure tell you anything? Is that a lot or little? It's always hard when you see these figures, right? But that's 1.5 times the fossil fuel emission through all of Europe last year. So just the wildfires in 2021 is 1.5 times the fossil fuel that we consumed across Europe. So big numbers. And that's where we can also help then, right? Because as an ICT industry, we had COP26 here last year in the UK, and as an ICT industry, through technology, we can help to reduce CO2 emission with up to 15% by 2030 by applying that. And how do we do that? That is on the private network side, and that is by engaging with the different verticals that's out there. So to take some examples, we've been involved with the port of Livorno in Italy. So by actually building a private network in that port and being able to better control where all of the containers are, and believe me, you can lose a big container in a port, there's lots of them. But also then just having the cranes and the trucks that's driving them more effectively because we could plan it more. We saw that we could reduce their CO2 emission with 8.2% in Port of Livorno. There's a number of ports we are engaged with right now here across the UK, which obviously has more of a business angle, but it's good to know that what we're putting in there will not only make it business-wise more effective, but it will also help society. Another way of seeing it is like in the mining industry. I used to be based in Sweden before, and we had a project with Boliden, who is a big mining company. Their biggest cost when driving or running a mine is electricity, because they need to have air condition and in order to have and they also need to clean the air in the mines in order to have people to be down in the mine. We put in a 5G system into the mine. We had that one having remote controlled trucks. So that helped Boliden in a number of ways. One, they didn't need people in the same manner down there, so they can actually turn down the air condition and save a lot of money on electricity. But they could also increase efficiency from that mine, because typically there's loads of toxic gases down in that mine after they've done certain explosions, and that's basically a production standstill for them. Costs a lot of money. The capex intensity in the mining industry is phenomenal. So when they could actually start mining directly after, that saves them a ton of money. So the business case for them, for private networks, was actually a no-brainer. But it varies between the different industries, right? So it's not just because it works for a mine, doesn't mean it works for a factory. What we have learned when we have engaged across all these different verticals is there's obviously huge differences. So you need to sort of treat every vertical as a vertical, and you need to understand the specific dynamics in those verticals. But being sort of an Ericsson or wherever you represent across this room, right, there's also a lot of commonalities. So we can actually have more of a platform thinking, because we can sort of build into our product some of the things that they all need. And they all need ease of installation and ease of integration. They all need good OSS systems, so they can actually monitor sort of how effective is our network, or how effective is sort of whatever processes that we are actually digitalizing. So those are some of the sort of common needs that we need to sort of make sure that we can provide, regardless of what's there. I touched upon the sort of security, so they want to know where their data is. But it's not always that the data needs to be local. It can be local, but in many cases they are happy to put data up in the cloud depending on what type of data it is. So again, it's more how do they run their business processes in a more effective way. So across the UK, obviously, we've sort of been on a journey, and just to sort of flash a few names here, but I will not spend a lot of time on exactly these. But there's a number of good initiatives that we have done and done together with DCMS, where we're learning a lot here also across the UK. Just to mention, like I was up in the Ford factory couple of weeks or months ago now, where there's tons of learning from that. Hyperbat the same. So all these learnings, we need to be able to secure that we share across these different industry verticals, right? And that will drive us closer to see that. And that brings me to this one. We typically on conferences like this, or when I get asked by analysts and stuff like that, they want to create some kind of a competition and like, is it going to be this or is it going to be that, and who's going to win, and it doesn't really matter. What we see is that Ericsson doesn't have the answer to each and every question. We need to work in an ecosystem where there's room for neutral host players, where there's room for specialized SI integrators, where there's room for operators. I know we sort of spoke before whether the operator has a role in this or not, but there's a role for many of us, and we need to create that ecosystem. And I think that's also sort of call for action I want to sort of have in here, right? That if we collaborate and drive this, we can actually help solve the business critical problems that those sort of enterprise customers are facing. Because one thing is quite clear, when we go out and meet these customers, they don't ask about whether we support O-RAN, or they don't ask whether we support 3.9 gigahertz or supplementary downlink in this or that. Those are questions I get from the operators. They know they have a problem today with spectrum. They know that their Wi-Fi systems is actually disturbing. They don't have a nice Wi-Fi system like you guys have in your offices, or we all have at home maybe. Like, I'll take an example. We put in a 5G system in our own Ericsson factory, and we had 10 different Wi-Fi systems because each and every vendor that we buy a production line from brings their own Wi-Fi system. So they're all disturbing each other, and they have a crazy sort of environment. So there's one thing we know is that we bring something key to the table, and that is that we can actually control and understand the spectrum, and we can manage the spectrum. And that's the skill we as a sort of telecom industry have, right? And that's where 3GPP was born. So having that skill is actually some asset we bring to the table, and that's a problem they know that they need to solve, because they have disturbance, they cannot trust it. Someone put in a microwave oven or something just next to it, and they suddenly have an issue. And they cannot afford that because they have a factory to run, or they have a port to run. Another thing that we see clearly is, and this is where the sort of redefining the business models are key, right? We're still deploying a lot of DAS systems, and this is a small cell forum. So we already know, and as Ericsson, we sort of stopped even investing in DAS years ago. So we have been focusing on really building a good radio dot system that you can all go and see out there. And there was people asking yesterday, like, oh, how small are they, and do they cover the entire band and stuff like that. That's all there. We have radios that will cover the entire bands. We have radios that can be shared. So the technology is there, but we need to evolve the business models because they have been sort of, everyone is used to deal with DAS, but DAS was built for voice. Now we're looking to digitalize industries, and that's a totally different play, right? So therefore, small cells will have a big role to play moving forward. The other thing we've also seen, and we're not showing that, but it's something we have done, is this simplification and making it easy to run and making it easy to sort of see. And that's what we call Ericsson Private 5G, where we then have pre-packaged solutions, where we then pre-integrate everything just to make it much easier for that enterprise company to actually get it to work, because they are not so interested in sort of slicing it up in 15 different ways. They want to have something that they can trust and know will work and will be trustable and their workhorse from their production environment perspective. So that's also something we have done. So to finish, right, I think with the private networks, it holds a lot of opportunities for small cells now. And that will be a big opportunity for all of us in this room. And it's more up to us to, we spoke about that before lunch, right? It's also like we need to make this happen now and scale and jointly be part of that ecosystem that can bring these business benefits that we all look for and want. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take a question, so Bjorn, before you escape. No. Oh, no. No, that's okay. Don't worry. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I think we'll keep the pace. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, and that sets the scene nicely. Now we're going to start the first session. I could ask, please, for the first panelists to come up, because we're going to start talking about spectrum. So Richard, Abaya, Mark, if you'd like to join me on the stage while I'm introducing the session, that would be appreciated. So there's always a debate when you talk about private networks and trying to, in what order do you discuss things, but spectrum is an important dynamic here. For some markets, they have been, and UK, parts of the Nordics, Germany, are moving towards dedicated spectrum for the purposes of private networks and letting the enterprises, the industries, have a fair amount of spectrum. And we can debate about whether it's enough or it's too much. But they're starting to get access to their own spectrum, and they can build their own systems with their ecosystem and of system integrators, and perhaps neutral hosts playing in there, and maybe also the operators. And in other markets, it's still, the operators are expected to provide the services and the connectivity for the industries, and the government ministries expect them to be providing that capability. Anyway, a lot of it will come down to what's the situation in terms of availability of spectrum. So let's have some different perspectives in terms of thinking about that. And I was very happy to hear that Ofcom were okay to come on stage and talk about the experiences of the N77 activities in the UK, and a reflection or a view on how that's going, having had that spectrum available for a little while. So Richard, over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Simon. I wasn't responsible for the spelling of harmonisation on that last slide. Good afternoon, everybody. So Richard Moore from Ofcom, working in the Spectrum Group there. So Simon's asked me to spend a few minutes to set the scene on N77, the shared access licenses that Ofcom makes available, have done since 2019, just to help me calibrate. Is anybody operating radios under the N77 shared access? No, not too bad. Very good. Thank you. Very good. All right, so yeah, I'll talk about what the shared access licenses are. Brief slide on how many we've issued so far and where they're being used. And then, as Simon mentioned, we'll look at how we see this going forward, how they'll be developed, what's happening across Europe. So, green button. Before I do that, I sort of slightly contractually obliged that if you're thinking about a private network or improving the wireless connectivity for your enterprise or your industry, these aren't the only solutions in town, these aren't the only technologies in town, 4G, 5G, these sort of licenses. So there are a range of other solutions available there, and Ofcom is sort of technology and spectrum agnostic. So yeah, it's part of a wider mix, and part of our job is to get that balance between the different technologies and the different spectrum to make sure that everybody can get connected where they want to across the UK to do what they need to do. Having done that caveat, so luckily, Bjorn's slide on the sort of sectors that they've been targeting and they see the growth in very much aligns with the sort of sectors that we see our shared access licenses being used in. So both indoors and outdoors, in industrial situations, whether that be inside a factory, or across a port, and then these sort of wider area deployments around agricultural applications and mining as well is an area that we've seen interest in. We're also seeing quite a lot of interest in using our shared access licenses, particularly the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz N77 license in FWA, and actually it's one of the largest take-ups we have of those licenses so far. So single set of licenses are being applied to various sectors. And in terms of where it sits in the sort of network architecture, looking at the bottom half of this slide, so we are at this private networks end. So we see that these licenses are being used for deploying dedicated 4G and 5G networks within an industrial enterprise environment. But we also see that they could be used as part of a hybrid network, so that you might extend and enhance the coverage of a national mobile operator's network with some cells deployed using the spectrum, and then be able to roam out onto the MNO's network. So it fits in that space. What I'm not mentioning in the slide pack actually is the local access license, and if you're interested in that and other ways to access spectrum, we can talk offline. I won't confuse the story. Let's focus on the shared access. And why is it called shared access? Because these are local licenses, so we are using the same spectrum in different locations across the UK. But it's also not just sharing with other people who want to use this stuff for industrial applications, but there are incumbents in these spectrum bands. So we have some MOD sites, we have some satellite ground stations, we have some radio astronomy, and we have some fixed links. So one of our challenges is to make sure that when we issue these licenses, that we are allowing those operators to continue to do what they do, and also to make sure that we're using this spectrum efficiently so that we can pack as many people in as possible that want to deploy networks using the spectrum. So just getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So it's not all about the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz. Our shared access license applies to 4 different bands. Actually, the most popular band at the moment is at 1.8 gigahertz. We also make spectrum available in the millimeter wave bands at low power for indoor use. The ecosystem there is very much still in the infancy. And these bands all sit pretty much adjacent to the national MNO's spectrum. So in terms of ecosystems, they don't sit bang on those spectrum bands, but they are to one side. So often the ecosystems are there, and particularly around 1.8 gigahertz. That was a real boost to the deployment of networks using that spectrum, because the devices, many mobile phones, were already supporting that spectrum. And it's one of the challenges going forward if to get the device ecosystems to support the bands that we're offering. We have 2 variants of the license, medium power and low power. So if you get a low power license, you can actually define a 50-meter area, and you can deploy as many radios in there as you'd like to, serving the sort of UEs around them. But if you go for the medium power license, that's a license per base station, and the license will specify where that base station is, so that we can obviously understand where the infrastructure is and be able to support you if there are interference issues, and know where all that infrastructure is placed. And it is, as Bjorn was saying, one of the benefits of these licenses is they are coordinated. We have looked at what spectrum is available. We have planned for interference, so you should be able to get the reliability and the resilience of your network that the 5G use cases that we've been talking about require. The other thing about spectrum is that surety of tenure. So these licenses you can renew each year, and you'll get that same license back. And they are relatively low cost. So they are not auctioned. They are assigned on a first come first served basis at a fee which effectively covers our administrative costs to issue. So just a couple more slides to wrap this up. So in terms of where we are at the moment, I mentioned the 1800 shared access license is actually the most popular one at the moment. That's partly because there were some legacy licenses we had that effectively were mapped into this new licensing regime, and one of the users of that was BT with their BT One phone system, which was a sort of enterprise voice service, so there's quite a lot of those systems still deployed. But over there on the right-hand side, the N77, the sort of clusters of red you'll see down in Cornwall up in the northeast, I think primarily FWA, but we are seeing a growing number of other deployments in industrial applications and campus applications. So it is quite encouraging, and talking to some of the vendors around the hall at lunchtime, the equipment is starting to come through as well, both on the radio side and on the device side, which is really going to get this moving. And so finally, just to sort of wrap this up, so we've been doing this for 3 or 4 years now. Simon mentioned that there's been slightly different approaches taken across the mainland Europe. So Germany are looking at 3.7 to 3.8. I think Denmark have got a slightly different arrangement for making access for private networks to this sort of spectrum. But encouragingly, what the European Commission has done is commissioned the CEPT, which is effectively a pan-national technical working group, to go off and actually look at the feasibility of using the same band across Europe for private networks. Obviously, different countries have got different sets of incumbents and different requirements, so that needs to be looked at. But work towards some technical conditions that could be harmonised across Europe and potentially even recommendations to ETSI and others on receiver performance. So it's a long process. Nothing happens quickly in spectrum, but through to 24, they'll be looking at that and coming back with recommendations back into the Commission, and then the Commission will decide, how forcefully they may want to push that into the member states. But I think what it does tell us is there is a direction of travel here. I think it's only going in one direction, and therefore I think there is some momentum around these bands to use this for private networks and industrial. And we, of course, when we first put these licenses out, it was quite a manual process, and we're continually looking to refine the level of automation we put in place, because if these numbers are going to grow, we're going to have to change the way that we authorise and issue these licenses to keep track of demand. And then finally, we're also starting to look at opening up that millimetre wave under a similar shared access license. So moving from the system we have today, which is indoor only, we put out a consultation document a couple of weeks ago on the broader millimetre wave release, and we've put some interesting proposals in there about shared access in local areas across the whole of the millimetre wave band at 26 gigahertz, but also having a dedicated chunk of spectrum even in urban areas, which would be available for shared access, leaving another bigger chunk of spectrum that we're proposing to auction, presumably to the mobile operators. So again, I think we're extending this suite of spectrum, slight risk of fragmentation of where should we go, but I think the mid-band spectrum is maturing really nicely at the moment, and I think in 4 or 5 years' time, the millimetre wave may really pick up in this part of the market as well. So that's
Super.
Simon.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. That's good. Well, we can do questions if anyone has any at the end once we've all sat down. So, Abaya, over to you to give us a perspective on N77.
Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon. My name is Abhay Sumanasena. I'm going to be wearing 2 hats today. I'm chairing the steering board at the Spectrum Policy Forum, which is the UK industry body looking at long-term spectrum issues. In the steering board, I have representatives from all the MNOs and key stakeholders, including the government and Ofcom. So in order to provide some meaningful insights, because we have diverse opinions, sometimes we don't have consensus, I'm going to wear my real wireless hat and give some insights. So my topic today is to give some learnings from N77 so far, the band that Richard mentioned, 38242, that upper part of the N77 band. In the UK 5G test and trial program, some stakeholders have been using that, and there's a concern about the device availability. Therefore, we carried out a study in partnership with UK 5G for DCMS, looking at this problem. Is it really a big issue, supply side issue, or is it really early market stage issue? And we found very interesting insights from that study, very recently conducted. So we carried out discussions with the stakeholders and a global survey, as well as roundtable discussions. And actually, interestingly, it's the biggest issue for the lack of, I would say, device availability is the order of volume, the low order of volume. That is mainly, we found 10 different issues, interrelated issues. And in fact, spectrum is one of the issues, but it ranked lowest, 10th. But In terms of, not necessarily all issues are related to spectrum, but some are related to general private network related issues as well. So order of volume, then supply side, the confidence is actually limited to use this because the market size, when we think about this N77, upper part of N77, the UK is the only, so far, I think that there are other countries looking at it, but so far it's mainly in the UK, it's looking at the use for the private network under this spectrum, shared access spectrum license framework that Richard mentioned. So therefore, the UK market is quite small, and that created some issues, lack of economies of scale is not available. Interestingly, although the band is available, it's supported in the device, it is not yet, it's not possible to use for some stakeholders because it's requires some level of interoperability tests, some additional tests which doesn't allow, because of the cost economics doesn't work, and therefore it's not possible to use in some cases. And then there are other things like the use cases. When we looked at the number of use cases and the type of devices required for use cases. Again, that so much flexibility sometimes create a problem in a way because that fragmented, it is fragmented, therefore the device, many different types of devices and very different types of use cases, and each different use cases require sometimes different devices. So all that fragmentation adds up, and therefore the volume is quite a challenging issue, as we found. And that also, in terms of regulatory restrictions, obviously we know the reasons that Ofcom why restricted the power levels, but on the user point of view, practical deployment point of view, that forces higher densification if someone wants to cover a little wider area, and that adds to the cost, and that creates another problem. So we came up with some recommendations, 27, many different recommendations themed into 4 different areas. So as in terms of market formation, the coordination of use cases and device requirements, that was one of the key recommendations to avoid, in a way, fragmentation. And also the architecture harmonization. Now, remember, these are all not specifically related to spectrum. However, they all are part of the issue here. So architecture harmonization, again, the private networks and some level of cooperation between the mobile operators and private networks to address the common issues. So that was something that we thought would be useful. Again, this fragmentation is creating a problem for us. I think I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to touch a little bit about access to spectrum. So this is the N77, which is a very good band, right balance between the capacity and coverage, but it is, dedicated spectrum, is it good or not? So the question is, to answer to that question, I think it depends, but if you go for dedicated spectrum and if it's not the mainstream band, unlike Germany, 37238 is the band that 100 megahertz that Germany has made available for private network, but in the UK it's 3.8 to 4.2. So it's slightly different upper edge of the mainstream band, and that is now we see some the stakeholders as identified, and some issues in terms of lack of the volume, lack of order of magnitude is low. So that's creating a problem. Whether it will it will become a better in terms of in the future when, as Richard mentioned, the European level looking at this band for this use, private network type of use, and over the time, will it be solved? We'll have to wait and see. So I'll pause there and I'll answer some questions at the end.
Thank you, Abhaya. So the last perspective is trying to learn a little bit from the US, which is the CBRS crowd have been pressing on. Let's hear some news from the US. Mark.
Good afternoon. So I think as I discussed before, Crown Castle is a shared infrastructure company. That's the tower, small cells, and also fiber. But now with the CBRS band becoming available, that enables us to then share spectrum as well. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'll be looking more at private networks versus the shared networks, but certainly conversations that we had earlier today of deploying a single radio that multiple operators can utilize. The CBRS band then enables neutral host players such as ourselves to be able to do that. So the CBRS band was allocated by the FCC to really be an innovation band and maximize, as Richard was talking about, utilization of the spectrum. So you have this 150 megahertz available, and how do I really maximize that use nationwide, different types of use cases, different kinds of players that can then use the spectrum rather than just the MNOs. Certainly the MNOs are interested in utilizing the spectrum as well, but this allows other players to deploy their own private networks and also shared networks too. So it's just a quick overview of the CBRS spectrum. As I mentioned, it's 150 megahertz. There are, as similar to the bands in the UK, some incumbents in there. And these incumbents are notified through the use of the SAS, or the Spectrum Access System, and also an ESC, which is an environmental sensing system when that spectrum is being occupied. It's looking like through activities of the Wind Forum that we're going to be moving from the ESD to an informed consent. So what that means is there's a user of the spectrum that then informs the SAS that, hey, I'm using the spectrum within this geographic area, here's the amount of bandwidth that I'm going to utilize, versus having a network of sensors out there that then listens for utilization of that spectrum and then responds accordingly. So there's 3 different tiers of users within the CBRS band: the incumbents, priority access licenses, and I'll get to that in just a minute, and then the general GAA users as well. So for the priority access licenses, that's 80 megahertz that's available. A single entity can only own 40 megahertz in a specific geographic area. And then the other 70 megahertz is available for general access. Although it's not specified, most of the deployments that we're seeing are based on LTE, 4G, that can move to 5G, but there's certainly other types of technologies that can be deployed within this band as well. So if I look at, there we go, the PAL auction winners, and these are the wireless carriers. Certainly Verizon went deep in several different markets, owning 40 megahertz. AT&T and T-Mobile also bought spectrum, and Dish, what we'd like to say, went wide across the entire nation. So rather than buying 40 megahertz in different markets, they bought 10 megahertz channels across a wide swath of the US. And the thing that's, we also had the cable companies, utilities, wireless internet service providers, universities, and enterprises. So that gives you an idea of the demand for spectrum that's out there. So it's not just the MNOs, but there are these other entities. And just to give you a sense of the number of utilities that went out and bought PALs as well. So why would they want to do this? Mission critical communications. If we look in California last couple of years, there were fires caused by down power lines. So if I can quickly monitor my power lines using a wireless network, that's something I want to be able to do. So there's interest from the utilities to be able to do that. Certainly wireless meter reading, rather than having to rely on unlicensed 900 megahertz spectrum. If they can deploy a PAL, that's more secure and more reliable that they want to be able to do. Even though the PALs were and are being deployed right now, there's a significant amount of spectrum in GAA, and certainly the two of them can work together as well. Just you can leverage the PAL plus GAA to expand the amount of spectrum that you can utilize. And we're seeing a number of use cases. As we were talking about, Erickson was talking about mining, oil and gas. Certainly there's no PALs out in the middle of an oil field, so I can have access to 150 megahertz, and a GAA is more than sufficient. So what are the use cases that we're seeing that are possible? I don't want to spend too much time on this because we've talked about some of these already, but certainly in the enterprise and looking at increasing MNO coverage. We talked about the high-rise buildings, how there's poor coverage in the upper floors. Shared access spectrum can enable multiple MNOs to use a single radio, become more efficient that way. If we look at the commercial front on theme parks, one of the deployments that we've seen is push-to-talk over a private band in the CBRS band, so back-of-house communications, push-to-talk, push-to-video. Certainly in the industrial setting as well, that's where we're seeing the most traction right now. It's a contained space, and then you can also deploy low latency applications there too. And one or two more slides that I've got left here. If we look at the spending by building category, certainly a lot of spending within airports, more not for the general public use, but back of house, airline use, offloading data from airplanes, warehouses, casinos, all the different types of environments that you might want a private network, and now you have access to that spectrum without having to rely on the wireless carriers. Some of the things that we've seen, and just looking, I'll leave the slide up here, as how the spending is happening within manufacturing, but really, and this was touched on as well, we need more devices, especially the IoT devices that support the CBRS band. Now that's certainly an impediment to be able to scale further. On the positive side, all of the handsets or the new handsets in the last couple of years within the US support band 48, and so that's available now. But as far as other devices, that's still a developing ecosystem. And the last thing I'll mention is expertise in deploying 3GPP-based networks. It's non-trivial to be able to deploy these networks, and it's very different from deploying Wi-Fi, so being able to have not only service providers, but also the system integrators to be able to deploy, operate, and manage the networks and user devices will be critical as we scale the use of this spectrum.
Super.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's good. So things are moving on then in terms of the adoption of that spectrum. Mark, looks quite interesting ecosystem developing around that. Are they developing, is there a little ecosystem developing their own special solutions, or they're still very much following the mainstream product lines? And
Now, what I would definitely see for the initial use cases around the CBRS spectrum, the majority of CBSDs or the devices, the radios that are out there are primarily focused in the wireless ISP, so very simple fixed wireless access. Okay. But then also looking at, and I think this is leveraged from experience within Germany and elsewhere in Europe, for factory floor. And so to be able to have that large coverage within an enterprise, not necessarily an enterprise, factory floor, warehouse, et cetera, where Wi-Fi isn't sufficient, and you need that wide coverage plus mobility, that's where we're seeing the use cases develop.
And does the CBRS, I noticed that Richard had a nice plot that shows utilization. Is there something that's also available from the CBRS Alliance? So it's a public domain that shows the sort of intensity of usage.
I'm not sure if that's available, but thanks for the reminder. So I know I just briefly touched on CBRS. So the OnGo Alliance has great resources on their website, including CBRS for Dummies, if you want to go ahead and take a look at that. I'm not saying anybody is, but that's certainly a reference that you could take a look at.
Because that was going to be my question to you, Richard. I mean, you had to, so nice in the map of the UK, and it shows actually it's not focused on a particular geography. There's a fair distribution. Is each of those dots a radio, or is that actually a network that you're showing on that?
So each of those dots would have been a license, so in terms of medium power, they would have been a radio. Right. I mean, the dots are probably quite big on the map.
Yeah. Okay, just trying to get a sense of the scale there.
Yeah, one quick comment I would make on the utilization of the CBRS band. So we have live networks in Southern California, in the Midwest, and in New York, as we've talked about, and we see utilization of the spectrum across in all of those different geographic areas, both indoor and outdoor. So certainly there's uptake and utilization of the band.
Yeah, Yeah, I think
In
about
terms of, I think, number of licenses, if we compare with the Germany, I don't know the most recent publication, but we hear about 100, 120 odd licenses. We also don't know how many of them are used, they are just licensed.
Okay,
And
yeah.
so
point.
we're, in the UK, we are slightly better in terms of number of licenses issued. I don't know if that indicates anything at all, but I'm sure it'll get there.
And in the survey you did with the UK 5G ecosystem, were there any? I think you didn't mention costs, so I guess that actually the model that Ofcom are employing in terms of a cost per site like approach is not something that came up in the discussions with the stakeholders as being a blocker or
I think it was a contributor in terms of because particularly the power restriction.
Okay, it's the power.
And, that will, some use cases where they need to cover a wider area, you will have to then densify more. That will increase the cost. So that was a factor, but I think amongst all the other things, that is also a contributor.
So, I mean, I certainly know that Ofcom's heard several comments from people about the power levels of N77, so I won't tread on that one too much. But actually, what I was quite interested in, Mark, was you mentioned John Deere, and just for those of you who may think that I've been having a private conversation, I have, in effect, earlier in the day, I chaired some round tables. Some of you were in attendance. So I may refer back to my experience of reflecting on the discussion from those round tables that I held around private networks. We were thinking about the landscape and the planning for the next year of activity in the forum and talking with DIT. And one of the areas that came up that really it's been sort of there in the background, but I hadn't really registered that perhaps this is a really interesting area. It's a sort of agricultural sector, possibly construction, but John Deere mentioned there as a holder of a power license. I mean, is there are they starting to look at things like as a service connectivity, so not just for their own personal use, but for their customers' use? So when they're using their plant, their tractors or whatever out in the fields, are they offering that as part of the package? I'm interested how John Deere are using that ownership of spectrum.
Yeah, I don't know the specific answer to the question of whether they're adding that into their business model, but what we're seeing in the agricultural space is a really demand to have what I would call more autonomous tractors. Right. There's a serious lack of people coming to be able to work within the farming community. So not only to be able to do that, to be able to help monitor what's happening on the tractor, the IoT devices in the fields, measuring moisture, pesticide use, et cetera. So all of those things really tie into that smart agriculture. Now, whether or not John Deere is going to deploy CBRS radios for the farmers to use, that I don't know the answer to, but they certainly could do something like that.
They could do that. Yeah. They wouldn't be precluded from doing that. I'm going to keep looking out to the audience. So I'm looking for... Oh, somebody put a hand up there, or was that stretching? Yes. So I won't, because I don't want to hog the stage. I can talk behind law. Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, it's Graham from Fisher. Interested in CBRS and how it's going with the mobile operators in America. Are they embracing it or are they fighting it? And how many of them have signed up to enable roaming their customers to roam onto and get incoming calls on the CBRS private networks?
Sure. So for the mobile operators in the U.S., Verizon, as I mentioned previously, bought a significant number of PALs, and they have deployed those in the right-of-way, so that we've seen it. That's for their own use. It's not shared spectrum at all. It's just doing carrier aggregation across their existing bands plus the CBRS band. As far as utilization of a shared network with multiple operators, one of the MNOs has done roaming and MOCN testing, integration testing with us. But as far as commercial deployments, we're still in the early stages of rolling it out. But they definitely see that one has completed the testing, the second one we're in process, and they see it as a cost-effective option to provide that in-building coverage like I talked about.
I think it's worth mentioning, Graham, it's a good point you picked up there. The issues that we identified, top 10 issues, roaming, complexities around roaming is one of the issues in the UK as well, some stakeholders identified.
So I think that's that hybrid model that we talked about, that segment in terms of that hybrid private network. And it seems to be a genuine need and requirement to work out the mechanism for roaming and what can be done there. So, and I think that there's clearly commercial issues to discuss there, but it's just what the devices will support and how they want to provision it. So that's an important area, and I've noted that as something that is worthy of further investigation and exploration within the forum, actually. There's an arm I can see over there.
Hi guys, Stephen Muldowney from EMS. Interested about the sort of the ecosystem and the spectrum. So if you speak to Qualcomm, they'll say, well, all our chips support N77, but we still have devices that don't, even though they've got the chipset, they don't support it. You know, and secondly, so you know that talking about the sort of push and pull. One of the ideas that he suggested, and I'll steal this from Nanda from Athernet, is to you know, we need to have the market driving so this uptake. So if we give some of the spectrum in the 3.8 to 4.2 to the operators, that will, because there's plenty of spectrum there, we don't need it all today. What that will do is drive the vendors, you know, to support these bands and start to, you know, we'll have more devices, you know, both devices and radio supporting that spectrum. Just interested to see whether anybody's got any sort of view on that. So
you're proposing we give the operators access to that for free, that spectrum?
Having worked for an operator, for a vendor myself at Huawei, I know that actually if the operators say to do something, then it will get done. So handsets will get done, the devices will get done, radios will start to support it because they'll see a benefit in doing it because there's a scale, a market scale. Yeah, okay, the private networks will eventually scale to there, but we can stimulate that market by making, you know, by opening up some of that spectrum to the operators, thus dividing the large vendors to make sure their devices and their radios support this band.
Okay, any thoughts on just giving the spectrum for free to operators?
So one of the reasons why this spectrum wasn't packaged up and auctioned on a national basis was because of these incumbents and the costs and the value, costs of removing them and the value that they bring to society. And so this spectrum is, you know, by definition going to be medium and low power and have more constraints on it, which don't lend itself to a national rollout of mobile networks. The mobile operators are able to get access to the spectrum. If they wanted to build a private network, they could take one of these licenses and not, you know, keep their spectrum free for their public network. So there's no stop there. But I take the point that anything that drives volume in the market will help. I think now as we look across Europe and the momentum we're seeing there, this band is a band that's used in Japan, and talking to some of the guys out in the hall today, I think one of the latest Samsung phones supports this band by default. So I think there is some momentum there, but I take anything that stimulates that demand and gets volume into the market is obviously going to attract more. So I think, you know, but I think we're on the edge of that happening. I think just to your point, I think I was surprised actually talking to the vendor community, both on the sort of CPE side and UE side and the chips. A lot of this sounds like it's prioritization because the chip maker will say, yeah, my chip supports it both physically and in the software, but I haven't actually done the testing with the next layer up yet.
Qualification.
So a lot of it's about prioritization. You know, all of those functions are already there and just need to be switched on. But because, particularly into a mobile operator, they have to be able to tick all those boxes of systems integration and QA, that's why it's not happened yet. So it's not like we need to wait for the next version of chip to come out. We just need to get, you know, that go up with priorities.
It feels like we're on the cusp, but it's a little bit like, Mark, what you were saying. What's really interesting about the industrial sector, and also a headache, as you were saying, Abhay, was that, you know, the consolidation of demand and quite a diverse set of interest around different devices, ruggedized or different form factors for different worker profiles, and you know, whether they're in a rugged environment or whether they're indoors or whatever. You know, just the bog standard Samsung slab smartphone is actually maybe not going to be utilized so much in the private network space. So having the supply of these devices is going to be important.
And what we're seeing in the initial deployments right now are using the CBRS band as an aggregation device. So you might have a LoRa connection into an aggregation device that's a CBRS that's coming back into the rest of your
A bit of tethering in effect, yeah. That's okay, and that's taking off as a way to deploy systems, etc. Also, like a router in effect that sits in the band. Right. Any observations, Abhaya, on that? Or?
Not particularly on that, but I think in terms of the volume. When I looked at the band, there's about 10 countries, if I remember correctly, licensed in different parts of this band, upper N77 band. So, and some countries are closely following the industry, and we hear this European development. So that will certainly help the more operators or license, the more device support, we will see vendors start to think about this band seriously.
So maybe, I mean, of course, the mobile operators have been masters of dealing with the roaming stories, and GSMA and others have enabled that for many years to talk at that level internationally between the operators. Perhaps part of the issue here is, each country has their own industries and they're serving, and there's not a GSMA-like entity that sits above and coordinates some of the narrative there. So, I mean, that's something I observed. So actually, there are countries using it. Are these countries talking, and are those ecosystems around those countries talking rather like a GSMA-like model to sort of bring, the concentration in terms of the demand and the scale and saying, yes, no, this is happening. That may be a useful thing to do.
Yeah. I think there's a broader point that we've observed in talking to various sectors and industry associations that, I mean, we're guilty of it in Ofcom of being spectrum-centric, and then we sort of push up from there and say, oh, here's your spectrum, why aren't you using it? Yeah. And many of these industries, when they think about digitization and actually using this connectivity to transform their businesses, it's a massive change in their systems model, their operational model. They basically have to re-engineer their business in order to justify the business case for putting in a new set of applications that then sit on top of a 5G network that then sit on top of some spectrum. Yep. And spectrum is way down the list of things they don't know about. So I think there is this big push, and I guess it's why DIT and others are interested of actually getting the business case at the top working and then creating that pull for that network connectivity. Nobody buys a 5G network for the hell of it. No. They buy it because it's going to transform their business, and that's exactly right. And I think the systems integrator community and the supply side needs to be able to educate them to know what the benefit they're going to deliver is, rather than us sort of pitching boxes.
So that's an excellent point. We'll close this session on that. But and in effect, that's why I designed the workshop this way up. So we're progressing from spectrum to the supply to the demand side. So we'll get to that part of the story later. And then we'll have the panel at the end. So great. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for preparing and being willing to enter into this panel. Thank you. Thanks for your time. So now this session really is going to be musical chairs. So could I have the next bunch of panelists up, please? Thank you very much. And we'll start to talk about, so that's Dritten, Tom, Stephen, Justin. Gentlemen, if you start moving towards the stage. And while you're doing so, I'll just set the scene very briefly here. So here we're now starting to look at, the supply landscape, broadly I'll call it. So, and that's supply not just of solutions and technology, but also perhaps some insights in terms of the business models as well, or the techno-commercial push that's coming principally from the supply side. So we can start to get a feel for what's on offer. And we may discover there's a bewildering selection of choices, which may be part of the issue for the industries who are looking at this piece. So let's go straight into the first presentation. Dritten, over to you.
Thank you. thank you very much. I think I go to the right panel after all. It's always a pleasure to be, although it is the first time that I come to Small Cell Forum. By way of introduction, I work as Director of Technology and for 5G and also co-director of Sonic Labs, a digital catapult, which is a technology innovation organization in the UK with a specific mission to accelerate adoption of digital technologies like 5G, IoT, immersive and AI, with a focus on manufacturing and creative industries. In the 5G space, or in the digital infrastructure, as I want to call it, we have established now a very, very strong technical capability in digital catapults, operating more than 7 5G testbeds across the UK, which have been designed, procured, built, and operated by us, with many people in the room that are effectively our suppliers and partners and collaborators. We use those platforms to support vertical industry innovation as well as support technology development itself in the open disaggregated in Open Run, which is the Sonic Labs. The brief for me today from Simon, and thank you for inviting me, was to talk about the current landscape for cellular private networks in the UK. Whilst we have done some quite significant work in the past 4 years in terms of understanding the landscape for anyone working in technically underpinned innovation, that is quite an important thing to understand. In what I'm going to say now, I will be drawing primarily on a report the Digital Catapult commissioned UK 5G Cambridge Wireless to work with Real Wireless on the status of the private network market in the UK. This follows a previous report that we published in November 2021 with Verizon on the status of the 5G private network. And I deliberately mention this because the focus today is not 5G focused, but it's private networks more broadly. We all know PCNs, private cellular networks, are not new. The 4G LTE solution made them a bit more possible, and the 5G, probably the main contribution of the 5G, brought the focus on the enterprise networking technologies, including the coverage or the opportunity, and it's still an opportunity, for demanding business-critical wireless industry vertical applications in manufacturing, logistics, transports, e-health, and construction. The development of these use cases that has happened progressively over the past 4 years is probably the most important thing because that has created two elements. One is exposed the mobile industry, including small cell forum players, in understanding what the demands are from this new segment in the market, the enterprise private cellular market, but at the same time increase the awareness for these people. And this is something that in particular has happened well in the UK. These past 4 or 5 years also have exposed a very, very fundamental problem, which is that the demand and the supply side for private cellular networks do not speak the same language. They have very, very different focus, and also they have slightly different expectations, and the supply chain for the enterprise networks where the private cellular networks will fit are different. And very, very often prospective buyers, this beachhead that has been created in a potentially new market in the PCNs with the 5G, but not only because of that, the prospective buyers in that space very, very often do not know where to start. It is too early to say that private cellular networks have bridged the gap in the journey to effectively shift from a telecoms connectivity provider into an IT enterprise network domain. And there are certain specific characteristics in that space. Good starting points in this space exist, in particular due to the extremely strong support by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport of the £200 million on 5G testbeds and trials. And that has established both more than 200 companies across this particular divide: enterprise, manufacturing, logistics, creative industries, etc., and the supply side, many of which are in this particular room. And also innovation hubs that do understand the technical challenges for delivering this kind of networks. As well, they sit in that what we call an elastic interface between the demand side, the manufacturers, the vertical industry adopters, and the providers, which is most of the people in the room. For a PCN, as we know, people will need 5 things. You'll need spectrum, you'll need a network technology, you'll need user devices, you'll need integrators of the connectivity platform, and in the enterprise space, you also need integrators of the data platform, the digital services platform. And in the UK, there have been changes happening across 4 of these. We heard about spectrum in the previous panel, and we will touch a bit on this again. Whilst the second element of that, the networking element, and many people in this room are witnesses to this, and it's continuing, the technology for the network side of private cellular networks is largely ready for adoption at scale. But the reality is that in the UK, as in the rest of the world, there is a slow initial uptake associated with difficulties in matching suppliers with buyers. Buyers are still not very clear in different industries. It's still an early market, even with the movements that we see in the UK. And the challenges in space, which I believe a lot of the speakers later on will touch on, is the cost of the equipment. It's coming down in the 4G. 5G still needs to come down. It's quite welcoming that both major players like Ericsson with their DOT, but not necessarily with their network offering. Bjorn, the core network is probably still a bit more expensive than it needs to be for a private network, but more importantly for other incumbents. The cost has made movements, but it's still not quite at the level that will be quite easy to be. The complexity is another matter which is connected to the skills base. The complexity is by far the most complex networking technology that we know today to be deployed and operated. And it is completely outside the skill base of the IT technology. The last thing that in the UK has moved quite significantly on the past 4 years, due to the efforts by everyone involved in that and with the funding of DCMS, has been on the industry awareness of the opportunity. This is one where 5G, even though through a cycle of overhyping, has helped to increase the awareness. The same overhyping also has been slightly counterproductive in making the case for the meaningful and purposeful use of the technology in the cellular private networks. Because these are still perceived to be primarily a telephony data services network with not easy integration within the IT systems of the enterprise, which is the ultimate goal of the PCN in any case. The last bit that is still quite a challenge, in particular in the 3.8, 4.2, but in general across the whole spectrum, and specifically in the 5G, 4G is slightly better, but not hugely better, is the device availability on anything that is not human-centric. So the key thing is the end-user devices and the integration of the end-user devices, the modem-enabled devices, in the supply chain of the vertical industries. That is the element that will make effectively the change in this industry. The last one that I want to mention is also the mobile industry competition. The options for the PCNs, from standalone to being part of an MNO, virtual or real sliceable network with extensions of neutral hosting, etc., and the interplay between service continuation, regionality, roaming that were also mentioned in the previous panel, make the PCN still a challenging market with a ready-made technology, but still a challenging market. So, how does the UK landscape for PCN looks like based on the report by UK 5G and Real Wireless? The reality is that most of the vertical industries would have heard by now about 5G private networks. Although 5G is often presented, still presented as a panacea and a solution for everything, and it is often used for pushing the 5G PCNs in and of itself, it has effectively shaken and brought the two sides of the market more closely together. However, it requires a management of the expectation and in particular the analysis of the return on investment and the real value of the network for a particular enterprise. And there are good examples that have been done in that, many of which in previous projects that were mentioned, including the ones by Bjorn at the opening of this session. Considering all of this, and in particular because of the past 5 years' contribution from the whole ecosystem, the UK is emerging as a bit of a pioneer in creating, testing, and commercializing new businesses in the PCN. There is a lot of testing that has been going on and a lot of information and knowledge acquired, less shared, but definitely acquired across the ecosystem. And in particular, what has been very, very healthy is more than 200 organizations, of which more than 2/3 are not telecom-based businesses, but they are vertical industries, are a lot more aware of the reality of this and can drive conversations in this space. And part of this, it is due to the 200 million pounds that the government, and I want to emphasize that not because on any relation with organizational or anything else, but because due is need to be given where due is, when credit needs to be given where it is due. The whole funding for R&D in Horizon 2020 in Europe, dedicated for 5G development and trialing, was 1.7 billion euros. And that was a contribution by 28 countries. The UK government decided in 2017 to effectively add to that 200 million pounds of direct investment from the UK. And if you look at that ratio, that was a very, very significant opportunity, which allows us today to speak about private networks as a potential reality and an early market creation. So, and that is what is the basis for the 5G testbeds and trials that effectively put forward that for every £1 that the government has effectively invested in that, there is a return of £15 into the growth of the UK economy. In this process, UK has developed a good number of specialized system integrator SMEs, some of which are in the room, or hopefully are still in the room, and whose scale in particular allows a bit of a more agile response and development, in particular to meet the specificity of the requirements of the market. One of the biggest challenges of this market is the heterogeneity of the customer base. A manufacturer is very, very different from a logistics operator, which is very, very different from a food or a chemical processing industry, which in turn is very, very different from an airport or a stadium. So, for us to effectively continue with this, what has been developed until now, and how to continue with this innovation over the past 5 years in ways that effectively grow this beachhead that has been created in the market sensibly and usefully, is effectively the biggest exam question at the end of the 5G testbeds and trials program, and what SCF, probably Smart Cell Forum, can answer next year.
Okay, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
We'll move swiftly on to Tom.
I'm going to hide my belly. So, Tom Bennett, CTO at Freshwave, and I'd like to talk about, obviously, neutral hosts enabling private networks. For me, the focus is going to be the customer throughout this conversation. And starting with the customer, what do we think about the customer? We've heard everything about use cases here and what type of industry. For me, when I think about a customer, if I'm honest, I'm thinking about my opposite number. I'm thinking about a technology director who has a budget, has a team, has a limited amount of bandwidth, a limited amount of resource, and an endless supply of chiefs complaining at them when it doesn't work. So, from a customer perspective, you've got the enterprise. And definitely for neutral host providers, ourselves and our competition, look, it clearly works. There is opportunity out there. We've got 2,000 connected buildings, over 300 of those are multi-operator. The customer as well, for me, and very clear for a neutral host provider, is also the operator. When I'm providing a neutral host provision into one of my customers, I'm providing an extension of the operator's radio plan. So I take it very seriously as a neutral host provider that my customer is both my paying enterprise, that poor IT director, and also the operator. I've got to be able to talk their language. I've got to make sure that my radio plan and my proposed bill of materials is signed off by them. So we very much work in collaboration, and that moves me to the second point for a neutral host provider, which is we very much work, and we're champions, we're very proud of. I mean, I've been in this industry 25 years, and I love the fact that I work in mobile. It's an ecosystem approach. You have to work in collaboration. That first collaboration is your customer, absolutely understand your customer needs. But broader, as we think about this small cell forum, I've heard over the last couple of days conversations on everything from silicon to bands, to architecture types, to industries. We've got to talk the customer's language. We've got to understand their need, and we've got to keep it simple. We have a tendency, and I'll put my hand up, like I said, 25 years in this business, that I love what I do. I am a fully paid up geek. But when I'm talking to my customer, do they really need to understand which of the bands there are? Or do they understand that actually there's a single plastic box on the ceiling? It's an access point. Do we need to understand and confuse them with a series of different architectural options? Or do they just want to know it's a really big router and it will do what they need? We've got to start talking about our customers in their language. We have this absolute tendency, and we love the tech. Our job, and in particular as a neutral host provider, is to keep it simple. Keep it simple into the customer's language. Somebody mentioned, and it's something you mentioned earlier, which was they're technically capable, but they have a limited bandwidth. When we think about the complexity in this room, our job is to provide a service. We have to provide that service to them. Again, what are they going to get in the neck for? They, the IT director, are going to get it in the neck if it doesn't work. And they, in turn, are going to provide that back to me. So what I'm looking for from this ecosystem, what my job as a neutral host provider is to provide not just that simplicity, but reliability. When we talk about this, we work in partnership and collaboration with the operators about, well, when is that new architecture ready? When's it ready for everything from DCMS-funded digital catapult university-style investments, where we'll go and work and we'll learn about this? And our radio engineers, we're very proud of our radio expertise and the fact that we can talk in the operator's own language, and we can work with the operators on ensuring the validity of those architectures. And I mean validity in terms of reliability and fundamentally unit cost. And when's that product actually going to be ready to go to market? Which brings me to the final point for that IT director sat there with his small budget and his small team. He is technically savvy. He just has a limited bandwidth. And then you come to unit cost. You've got to come and ask yourself, okay, why is it they want this network? They probably understand that maybe they've got an existing Wi-Fi network, but it's reached its maximum limit. It's not cost effective. One of our private networks is an FWA piece. It's for caravan and holiday parks. And working in collaboration with the ecosystem, with the likes of Athernet and Nokia, and Vodafone, to be clear, a local access license, we delivered now, working with them as partners, to our customer a very robust FWA service. It's private networks, but it's the kind of unit cost that wasn't achievable by digging up several miles of road that in a area of natural beauty. It wasn't available because, you know what, Wi-Fi relay, we all know, has a little bit of an issue when it comes to interference. So for me as a neutral host provider, I'm very proud of where I work, I'm very proud of what we do, I'm very proud of the expertise that we have. And the one thing that's kind of not been mentioned in the room, quite interestingly, is the hyperscalers. For me, you can never hyperscale that last half mile. I'm quite proud of where we work, and I know that when we think about UK and we think about our ecosystem, it is a global ecosystem, and it's absolutely about collaboration. But you've got to start and finish with the customer. What's their need? What's the local environmental need? That's an area of local expertise that the neutral host providers are there to provide, and we do a very good job, in my opinion. So I'm going to close there.
Great, thank you. That was a good pitch for the neutral hosts. So an interesting competitive landscape of localization of needs and really being on the ground, so to speak. Right, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you so much. Very good. Do we have slides? Or? Yes, we do.
We do, and there's your clicker.
Perfect. Oh, thank you so much. So, I'm Stephen Patrick, CEO of Cable Free Wireless Excellence. We're a wireless equipment manufacturer based here in the UK. So we both design and manufacture small cells and macro radios here in the UK from our base on the Oxford Science Park. So just sharing a few thoughts on these two topics, which are spectrum sharing bands and, of course, the move towards O-RAN. So as a radio vendor, you respond to your customer needs. You try and be as visionary as possible, try and make sure your products are as applicable and relevant to the market today and, of course, the future markets. One thing we saw coming up a few years ago was this availability of spectrum sharing bands enabling private networks. And we engineered up a range of products which would be applicable for that, both indoor and outdoor small cells, as well as macro versions. And very quickly, we got drawn into a lot of these DCMS projects, which we mentioned as, I think, one of the more significant radio vendors, both with small cells in projects like Liverpool 5G, they're all our radios, things like Mobile Access in North Yorkshire, which is a macro cell deployment, as well as several different other small cell and macro deployments. As a radio vendor, there are major challenges in designing products for different bands and different power levels, and it's quite remarkable. Ofcom gave us those 3 different bands I mentioned there on the slide below. And also, from our perspective, engineering up products that can do that in different power levels as well. This is a very simple diagram of a cell site. It has a small cell up on the tower and co-located with an antenna, and of course some form of backhaul. It could be microwave, fiber, it's completely agnostic. And in the case of a non-O-RAN deployment, of course, this goes directly to the network core. In the case of O-RAN, then of course we have other boxes in the ecosystem. So there's an architectural debate about where those would live, and in fact, whether that's desirable in different types of networks. A typical outdoor small cell is a box like this. It has fins. It's designed to be long-term mounted outdoors in all different climates and weather conditions. By the way, we sell globally. Across all our product ranges, we have customers in about 86 countries to date. So we have to allow for the hot countries, the cold countries, the wet ones, the dry ones, and everywhere in between. A typical radio like this has a fiber optic connection, or for short reaches, copper connection if it's going straight to a microwave backhaul. And it's available in either 2x2 or 4x4 MIMO for higher capacity. And of course, we have to keep track of 5G. 5G is not static, it's moving fast. We're currently release 16 compliant, and as we all know, release 17 is just around the corner with yet more features, enabling more applications. So there's a big pressure in the vendor ecosystem to stay on track of the evolving status of 5G. When it comes to indoors, there are different solutions. Some people talk about DAS, some people want small cells, and the solution largely is tailored to fit the customer need and application. This indoor small cell is in fact fully shipping and available. One of the features we found is in fact was caused by the global chip crisis is we fortunately designed ours using x86 type processor platforms, and we didn't use any of the SoCs available from the likes of Qualcomm and people like this. Fortunately, that saved our product range because the SoCs went unavailable and were delayed. So having taken the generic silicon approach, we're actually insulated largely from the chip supply problem. So we're shipping far in advance of, I think, several other vendors. So this indoor small cell is like a shrunk version of the outdoor small cell. It can be mounted on ceilings, walls, industrial spaces, and in some use cases can even be mounted in backpacks to be person carried or put in vehicles for sort of mobile small cell applications. These are available both in traditional MNO bands as well as spectrum sharing bands. So if you're an MNO, you can use the product in your own bands. If you're a private enterprise user, you can buy the version that supports the shared spectrum bands. And of course, there are local access licenses as well available off the MNO bands, which is another use case. Last, I'll leave you with this, which is a new product. This addresses the upcoming needs for multiple applications. We work with a partner who's particularly focused on EV charging, and now there is a government mandate to put electric car chargers on city streets. And they came to us saying, can you put a 4G and 5G base station in the pole? We said, absolutely, we can. So in a single pole, you can have EV charging, you have Wi-Fi 6, you can have millimeter wave backhaul, and the 4G, 5G radio, and the canister antenna, complete with GPS lock. That photo is actually a real unit. It's on the Oxford Science Park, and it works. And the idea was to remove any of that street clutter. So there's no green box next to it. The full radio is in the pole. It's a slim pencil design, a mere 18 centimeters in outside. and it can have optional street lighting as well. So this was a vision to the now and near future of how do you overcome the street clutter, still deliver what people need, which is 4G and 5G services, address the sort of tangential requirements of EV charging, to justify that dig once, fit once, and then of course allow it to be upgraded in the future when that's needed. And one of the visions for this is also to allow it to be neutral host and O-RAN capable as well. So I'll leave the slide there on the screen. And
thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you. And ideal for coverage on your local boating lake. Fantastic. Right, okay, Stephen. Next Stephen. Two Stephens. I get confused. Stephen Muldowney.
That's okay. Hi, guys. So, Stephen Muldowney, you probably know I'm an independent consultant. Here today represent Electronic Media Services, and I really want to talk about supply side. So, I'm going to talk about a real-world project and when we spec'd it out originally and how that would look today differently where we are in terms of the market. So, Electronic Media Services have done a private mobile network in Borden in Hampshire. It's a smart city, smart town. It's a brownfield site it's a big housing development with about 3,500 homes being built in there, as well as a small sort of town centre that has shops, cinema, a leisure centre. It's not to replace the existing centre, but just to provide a sort of campus feel to this area for the new residents on there. And EMS won the contract to supply the private mobile network there. And when we were speccing it up about 12, 18 months ago, we had the option of whether we could, the end customer was open to whether that was going to be LTE or 5G, but much like Tom said, they don't really care. They set a spectrum what they would like to do today in the future. So we looked at sort of all the options around what's available. So spectrum, yeah, we can get spectrum. Equipment, no. That was, we couldn't, the supply of sort of N77 radio was very small at that time, limited number of suppliers, but particularly it was the ecosystem. We wanted to connect a number of devices to it for push to talk, for IoT, and there just wasn't the sort of the ecosystem. So we went with an LTE solution. I should also say that also commercially as well, at the time, the business case didn't pan out for that sort of level of investment to put that equipment in. So we were looking at now today, 18 months on, would we make a different sort of decision process? I don't think we would do, and I think that for a number of reasons. Firstly, the spectrum hasn't altered, so that's no difference in terms of there. Yes, there are more radio vendors that we could use to deploy the network around that. But we are still limited, both in sort of, the options in that place. But I think it also comes down to the economics. We're still seeing the cost of those radios 2, 4, 5 times the cost of what we can get in the LTE world. So, in that case, the use cases we could, deliver on LTE. Future ones, we know we can't, and so we will have to do an upgrade to the network at some point around that. And the options we had weren't at that time available where we could do that via software, so we know that's going to be our hardware. But actually that economically still stands up, in terms of being able to deploy that. So, but I think also it's still that the ecosystem, we will still have a restriction on the devices that were available that we could connect to that network today. So I don't think, from a supply side, would we do anything different, 12, 18 months on? No, we wouldn't do. So, but again, but we know that actually we can, migrate that network to be 5G as and when we need those use cases, have the use cases come on board that we need to deliver that. I said the site is Whitehill and Borden in Hampshire. You're more than welcome to come and visit if you have any interest in sort of that installation. And the second one I want to talk about is around construction. EMS is a sort of small system integrator, has had a long focus around connectivity in different verticals, but particularly around construction. They've had a bonded CPE device that they've sold a lot into the construction aggregate business. And so we've had a focus around private mobile networks in this space, and we've done various webinars and face-to-face events and wrote a number of white papers on this. And so I had the chance to go and visit a construction site. I was asked by a construction company to sort of go to their site to talk about you know, they were thinking about doing a proof of concept at a construction site. So really great to go out and see. Again, something that Tom said, to go and speak to the customers and see what the real world is like, rather than what I think it is and when I write white papers and et cetera around the subject. And the interesting bit here was around that the restriction around the supply chain was not about could we deliver a network that could cover the construction site. Absolutely, that's not a problem. Quite a simple site. Connectivity wasn't going to be a problem in terms of getting, you know, to power the network and get backhaul. You know, there was places we could fix the radio to give good coverage across the site. The issue was they'd already had handsets. So they've got thousands of handsets they've already given out in tablets they already use across the site. And so they say, well, can we use these? And we're going, well, yeah, you can, you know, but we can't do, you know, and again, we're trying to explain the difference between the different bands and what you can do within the LTE and the 5G world. And so, you know, we have an issue there that that they really want to try out 5G, and that's their sort of goal because they've got some of the use cases and there's some push within their business that they want to do this. But we're at a point where we probably won't be able to deploy that because, you know, ultimately, you know, they're not going to replace the devices. And even for the proof of concept, they're not going to be able to get a couple of devices in. And secondly, also, this is a very dynamic environment. You know, I mean, dynamic in terms of it's not just the construction sort of contractor that's the primary one. They've got lots of other vendors coming on construction, coming on site. So they've got deliveries all the time. We want to be able to get the people when they come on site to be able to use the network. And so having that sort of capability to deliver it is quite cumbersome at the moment, not an easy one, because reality is that we can't just give them a SIM to put into the phone. We can't just give them a QR code to scan to get an eSIM, because the devices, they've got no confidence that the devices will there. So from a supply side, I would say that you know, from our experience, that so it's a very complex environment with lots of different challenges. And actually, there's lots of different things that need to be taken into consideration. And actually, we're not at that point yet where, you know, it's very simple to deploy these networks and deal with the challenges that the end user have, the construction sites. You know, there's lots of compromises. I think earlier in the spectrum, talked about, you know, there's good spectrum for giving good coverage, but it doesn't give, you know, very good throughput. It's the same, I think, in this world in terms of when we talk about supply side, you know, delivering against those requirements. We've got lots of challenges that are in the place, and that's to do with, you know, the supply of the equipment, both from a network and being able to deploy it, but also from what the end user has and how we can integrate that into a single network. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Stephen. So, plenty of scope for system integrator business, and there's no turnkey solution yet. We're still at the early stages of this market, really, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, no, definitely so. You know, as you know, I also do some work with Ethernet, and so we're trying to build some solutions. We do some work with Stephen, so we've done some successful projects, but it is still a struggle to build those, systems, in particular the ecosystem. Yeah. I think we're not in a position where we can deploy networks. That's not a problem. And that's quite simple. It's that ecosystem of things to connect to it. And going to the site was a real eye-opener in terms of, you know, what they're using. To be honest, they rely on WhatsApp. They do everything by WhatsApp. Yeah. This is a huge construction company, and they are doing everything by WhatsApp. Okay. Because that's simple. It's simple, but it's really inefficient because they're having to constantly go back to the cabins where they've got connectivity to do this work. There's no that flow, so it's quite inefficient in terms of they have limited Wi-Fi coverage, but in terms of being able to use some of the, you know, digital tools, the BIM they've got, the scanning that they can do, really they're really restrictive on it, and it's very much a go to site, come back, load it up, wait for it to happen, you know, or go back to the sort of offices to be able to do this. So it's a very it just isn't that end to end.
Great. Okay, final presenter. Then we'd have a chance for questions from the floor. And I may chip in with a few. So, Justin will give us a view on Open RAN.
Brilliant, thanks, Simon.
And private networks, two good hot phrases.
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. Justin Sims from Parallel Wireless. Okay, so Open RAN is the movement in the wireless telecoms industry to disaggregate hardware and software, creating open interfaces between them. This is allowing us to move from the costly proprietary solutions onto a COTS-based open software with open interfaces, which also is going to broaden the vendor supply chain that's available. Essentially, all we're doing is mixing and matching the software and hardware, the radio elements, and the off-the-shelf servers. This does create a challenge in the security arena, where we have multiple vendors, we've got multiple open interfaces, and we have differently distributed network components. However, the actual physical architecture here in Open RAN isn't too dissimilar from a normal RAN deployment, and specifically for Open RAN, the public and private type of deployment doesn't really have to differ too much. It's more of a dimensioning component issue. So Parallel Wireless are lucky to be involved in two DCMS-sponsored projects on the Frank program. The first one is Project Proteus, which is creating a non-IP locked layer 1 5G small cell solution, which gives us the benefit of running on either x86 or, more importantly for this project, moving on to an ARM-based processor. This integrates with the CUDU, and we are also integrating with an N77 5G radio unit from Cable Free. The purpose of this is to remove the complexity and give us a more flexible deployment and better access to off-the-shelf servers. And essentially, as the Open RAN architecture is to remove all the barriers to the complex deployments that we can have in the current system. Okay, the second project that we're involved with is Project Oranos. And Oranos is looking at the possible interactions between public and standalone non-public networks. The vision here is we're going to be using a RIC, so the RAM intelligent controller, to control admission and mobility between multiple network types. So traditionally, user equipment connected to a private network would remain in the private network, mainly because of the complexity, the cost to allow the equipment to roam outside into a public network is a bit prohibitive, and for the limited advantages, probably not worth doing in the current solutions. The rise of connected solutions, 5G, I think we're going to see that roaming between the public, non-public networks is going to increase, and going forwards, that's going to be a big thing. So going back to the security implications that I mentioned earlier, we're going to have separate networks that are controlled by two or more entities, and those networks are going to have to interact with each other. So looking through for some of the other work that I've been doing with the upcoming telecom security requirements, it looks like, although not fully understood by, I think, MNOs and vendors, but there's going to be an extra bit of complexity thrown in here. Private networks aren't really regulated by the TSRs or covered by the TSRs, so that gives us the possibility of private networks being deployed with high-risk vendor equipment. And we could end up in a situation where we have private networks with that equipment in, where we are not going to want to interact into a public network domain with them, which is going to cause a problem. Maybe we should look at regulating the private network space. We don't want to build a host of private networks that future down the line we can't interact with from a public perspective. The other thing, as I mentioned, we're going to have more distributed nodes from an Open RAN perspective. So we're going to have to operate more of a zero trust model, where currently we have a perimeter model where everything is within your safe network. Now we're going to have small cells distributed throughout the estate, and a full zero trust model using RIC or maybe some other means. But there's going to have to be an evolution in security to support the Open RAN architecture. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Raising some. So there are two projects there in the pipeline, again funded through DCMS and the partners engaging, potentially raising some questions there. And I'm reminded your comment there about the TSRs. I think there were some comments yesterday from Louise, who was on the stage, who did in her presentation. She was principally focused on DCMS view on public networks, but she did recommend that anyone who's building private networks is aware of what's happening in the public network space in the UK. So if you're building private networks, be aware of it. Or we recommend, I think she said, we recommend you take them on board. And so it's not mandated, but it's a way to show that there's some potential direction that needs to be followed. You need to be aware of it. Okay, I'm going to look to hands. I'm going to try and keep quite strongly to time, so I'm not going to give a lot of time for questions. Oh, yes, gentleman over there was a question. So while the microphone is making its way, actually it's making its way fast enough, I won't have time for a question. So he's obviously had his coffee.
Thanks. Keith Dyer from the Mobile Network. It's not really to push back on Tom's snappy comment about hyperscalers, but more to get a wider view perhaps on their role. You said they can't do the last half mile. I'm sure AWS with its private 5G would have a view, maybe not in the neutral host, but I'd be interested actually for a couple of opinions on where you see them playing in this market.
Me?
Yeah,
I'll start.
Yeah, go on.
I think from a neutral host, and in fact, think about any enterprise, whether it's neutral host or not. When I make the snappy comment about the last half mile, what does a hyperscaler do? It's software. And you can scale that in a data center very, very simply. We all know they buy tin on a scale better and cheaper than anybody else. But fundamentally, when you're connecting a building, and in particular with an established economy like ours, sometimes they are modern buildings, 22 Bishopsgate. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're a legacy hospital. That's what I mean by you can't hyperscale. You are still going to need to go survey. You need to go and produce a radio plan. You need to get the radio plan signed off with the operators. Or if it's a private network, make sure the bill of materials for your own radio plan is appropriate to the customer's needs. That is what the hyperscalers will always need to partner for. Their business model is on IT services, but it's predicated on connectivity. That connectivity you still need to provide locally. Anybody else?
Yeah, so I would say that they're very good at sort of doing the high volume, low, complex deployment. So anything that's sort of vanilla type, where it's just connectivity, they, within a urban environment where there's infrastructure, then that's okay. That's going to be suitable for them. I think anything that needs sort of, they're really detailed system integration skills, some things that Tom talked about. I think they will, shy away from that. So I think that if you look at what they've done in the US, then, that's where they've been successful.
Britain, you have a...
Very, very quick, because I ate a lot of time. I didn't notice the clock.
We won't hold it against you.
But I personally, I have only two points. One is I wouldn't dismiss it, because the fundamental challenge for private networks is starting and ending with a customer. And the hyperscaler model, on one side, they have the scale and the money that they can throw at this problem. But more importantly, they know that they can start on a market even from the standard buildings before they can go to the other one and build the capability as part of that process. So that would be my number one from the hyperscalers. Point number two is The interest, the AWS offering in the US is particularly interesting because it shows that there is a market. It's a market enabled in particular from CBRS, but there is a market and then they would want to address that. And there is a particular ecosystem that, again, hyperscalers are very, very, very good to take advantage of. And my last point is back to the ecosystem. The hyperscalers will not do this alone. They will still need to do with specialized companies, including like Freshwave, which I'm very happy to say we are working together. But that is the particular space where kind of ecosystem is particularly important and understanding. So that, but I wouldn't dismiss it. It's a good sign, as well as they can move very, very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an interesting model because at the UK 5G showcase, which some of you were at a couple of months ago, and you know, the AWS presented. I'm not a flag waver for AWS, but I thought it was an interesting way of challenging the status quo. No, this is all OpEx. Just stick in the post what you think you want to cover, and we'll do an automated radio plan and work out how many things we need to stick in a box. Send it to you, and then you just pay on a monthly basis. When you're finished, put it in the box and send it back. Okay. Sounds good.
For a shopping mall,
practice,
maybe not for a factory.
Yes, exactly. So of course we've got to bear in mind, I guess, that you know, in a nice warehouse-like environment, that may well be fantastic. We're talking about construction sites and some tricky historic buildings. It may not be so easy to make that model work, but it's clearly a disruptive way of thinking about things. And I guess it gives you the opportunity, Stephen, to ship in some radio heads into those packages.
Well, absolutely. Just a quick note on that. So an enabling technology needed for mass scale deployment is DSA, Dynamic Spectrum Access. So today, if you go to apply for one of these N77 licenses, you go to Ofcom, traditional process, they hand you a piece of paper or PDF back, it tells you what spectrum to use, and you have to manually configure your radios to do that with a set of rules attached. What's needed is software which will automatically negotiate that license. Sure, you're going to pay the money, but you, the radio owner, don't necessarily select which channel you're on or the power levels. And this already exists in CBRS, but what's needed is a far more intelligent and flexible mechanism to that in the UK, and I think Europe-wide for private networks. That's a key enabling technology for mass deployment, I think, for 5G.
Okay, super. I'm looking for hands. If I don't see hands, I shall just dip in with one of my questions because, oh, sorry, I'm short-sighted. Richard.
Dritten mentioned that the sort of network layer is coming together, but I think, Dritten, you also mentioned this sort of digitization application layer. And I'm wondering whether that piece of the puzzle you're seeing, are you partnering with those people that will take the applications and the real value add piece in? I can see the AWS helping with that. And Stephen, your example, it sounded like the building site just wanted connectivity and then they'd use WhatsApp on top of that. But are you guys partnering with the real value add, or do you see your customers actually knowing what they want to put on top of these networks?
So from our perspective, it's just an IT, so it's just we just see it as IT. So actually we try and not make it too complex in the sense of they can connect to the site, then their application is available. So it's just it's an IT issue. So we do work with some of the sort of to add the value in some of those applications, but generally they've already got those relationships, and so they're doing that. I mean, there've been some elements in like maybe to push to talk, etc., for mission critical, but generally it's not. You're just giving them it's an IT, environment that they're quite comfortable with, and so they can connect their in-house applications or their third-party applications.
Interesting. Tom, is that an area where you're exploring the possibility of partnering with application level experts in sectors and starting to come up with a solution?
I mean, as a neutral host provider, look, we're connectivity experts, and we're proud of that. We're very good at that. You're quite right. A customer will come to us. They may come to us, and we can make recommendations to them and say, look, here's some partners we work with in this industry. Other times, and it's interesting, there's various different business models. It's an agility to work within those different business models, because sometimes an SI will come to us and say, well, actually, we need you to provide this private network. That's fine. We're okay with that.
Okay. Yeah.
If I may add to that.
Yes, because I mean, that's actually the digital catapult is playing in that application space, and looking at that layer is an important part of the ecosystem, isn't it?
That's the bit that I wanted to refer, and one of the biggest lessons that I think we have learned from interacting with the ecosystem is that sometimes this idea that has come from a mobile industry that we will address vertical application and we'll speak to the manufacturer or speak to the logistics company, in and of itself probably is not very clear. And in the report that will come, it's actually picked up by that the supply chain, when you go into that enterprise space, is probably a lot more, it has a couple of other elements in the chain, one of which is typically the system integrator of the data platforms. So it's, we ourselves, up to 2 years ago, we would talk about manufacturers as if the manufacturers will come and buy the particular 5G connectivity. But in a report that we published 2 years ago, 72% of the manufacturers did not consider connectivity as their particular challenge. But they considered their challenge, how could an improved digital system provide what they needed. So who is the person that provides that? Typically will be system integrators, which are not system integrators of connectivity alone. And I think that is probably one of the challenges. And those system integrators, there are two groups. They need to be agile. If there are the more mature ones and the bigger ones for the bigger manufacturers, usually they will be a little bit more risk averse in innovating in this space. And that is why this is still an early market space.
Okay, that's very interesting. All right, I'm going to draw a veil over the session, and thank you, gentlemen, very much for your time and contributing to a very interesting discussion. Thank you.